All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2023 Pulse Bar Ops 3-week lecture series. I will be your host for today's session. My name is Shelo Ann Pabella. Before we officially begin, let me give you a quick summary on what this event is all about. So this is actually the Bar Ops 2023 3-week, a discussion on the frequently asked topics on the 8 bar subjects. This is an exclusive project of the Philippine Association of Law Schools, or PALS, and the Rex Bookstore. We have been conducting these 3-week lectures in the past few days, so if ever you have missed a few of our lectures, you can head over to the Facebook pages of the Philippine Association of Law Schools and Rex Bookstore to view all the videos available there. We also encourage everyone to please like, subscribe, and follow the pages of Pulse and Rex Bookstore so you can be updated on upcoming discussions and programs. For some house rules during our lecture, I would also like to remind everyone that throughout our 3-hour lecture for today, kindly refrain from recording or reproducing our discussions and lectures for personal gain. Again, everyone can view anytime our lectures through the Pulse and Rex Education Facebook pages. If you also have questions during the lecture, you may comment it through our Zoom chat box, and we will entertain them at the end of the discussion during our Q&A portion. So I know I've said pretty much everything, so without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for today for our pre-week lecture on taxation law. So, our speaker earned her Bachelor of Laws degree in 2007 from the St. Louis University, Baguio City, where she was an academic scholar and graduated as the class valedictorian. She became a member of the Philippine Bar in 2008. Thereafter, she earned her Master of Laws degree from the San Beda University. She is also a certified public accountant, having been admitted to the accountancy profession in the year 2002. Subsequently, she served as an auditor in the Joaquin Cunanan & Co., now Isla Lapana, a member affiliate of the PricewaterhouseCoopers. She was a former trial attorney and legal officer at the City Legal Office of Baguio City. She is also the Dean of the St. Louis University School of Law. She was one of the members of the Board of Trustees of the Philippine Association of Law Schools, or PALS, and the Oversight Committee on Clinical Legal Education Program, or CLEP, created by the Supreme Court. She previously served as the Associate Dean and Department Head of the Department of Commercial and Taxation Laws of St. Louis University. At present, she is heavily engaged in tax advisory, tax compliance services, and accounting consultancy, currently serving as an accounting, tax, and corporate or business consultant for various businesses in Baguio City and Metro Manila. She likewise has extensive experience in representing clients before the Bureau of Internal Revenue, handling letters of authority and protesting tax assessments, as well as before local governments concerning local and real property tax assessments. She also actively gives bar review lectures on taxation, presently affiliated with the Albano Bar Review Center, Villases Law Center, and the Chan Robles Internet Bar and CPA Review. Guys, please let us all welcome Dean Christine Angelica B. Elveña. Dean, the floor is yours now.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I just like to rectify one description. I am no longer the Dean of St. Louis University. I am the former Dean of St. Louis University. So I'm glad to be here today. And basically, since I only have like 2 hours and a half to discuss important topics in taxation law, I'd like to start my lecture. So Again, the focus of this lecture will be on the highlights of taxation law. I'm hoping that I would be able to discuss the 5 questions to be asked during the 2023 bar exams. I think the most important topic under general principles would be you knowing the description of the power of taxation. Please take note that if you would describe the power of taxation of the state, you have to describe it as an inherent power. So power of taxation is an inherent power insofar as the state is concerned. However, that is not equally true when it comes to the local government unit, because for local government unit, the power of taxation is not inherent, but rather directly conferred under the 1987 Constitution. Now, several things that I'd like to remind you about under constitutional and inherent limitations would be, first is the due process clause of the Constitution and the constitutional tax exemptions. So first, under due process clause, you just need to remember that capital cannot be subject to income tax. Capital cannot be subject to income tax. In fact, in the 2019 case of Association of Nonprofit Clubs Incorporated versus BIR, it has been emphasized that the imposition of income tax, take note of the type of tax being imposed, it's income tax, not VAT, not business tax, but rather income tax. If income tax is imposed on the capital, such will be considered as an unconstitutional confiscation of property. Okay? So, in this particular case of Association of Nonprofit Clubs, it was ruled by the Supreme Court that the imposition of income tax on the association dues shall be considered a violation or infringement of the due process clause because association dues represents capital. Why will we consider association dues as capital? It is because they constitute the fund being created by the members of that club, and therefore being in the nature of a fund, then it represents the capital of that club or of that association, and in which case the imposition of income tax thereon shall be considered as an infringement of the due process clause. Please take note that another issue in this particular case is the imposition of value-added tax on the association dues. And according to the Supreme Court, value-added tax cannot be imposed on the association dues because those are not collected in connection with in the ordinary course of trade or business. Please take note that value-added tax will be imposed upon the sale, barter, exchange, or lease of goods or services in the ordinary course of business. And since there's no business involved in this particular case, then the association dues is not likewise subject to value-added tax. Now, there are 2 cases. The first case has been decided in 2020, and it involves membership fees being collected by the Federation of Golf Clubs of the Philippines. And in this same case, the Supreme Court held that the membership fees cannot be subject to income tax and value-added tax, with the same reason that I had mentioned in the 2019 case of Association of Nonprofit Clubs. Likewise, in June 2022, the Supreme Court also emphasized the principle that association dues cannot be subject to income tax because doing so will violate the due process clause of the Constitution. And this is the case of Fritz Brian Anthony M. De Los Santos versus CIR. Again, same reason. Another aspect that I'd like to remind you about is the aspect on direct double taxation. Direct double taxation is not explicitly mentioned under the Constitution. Please take note that there is no specific provision under the Constitution that deals with direct double taxation. But if the taxing measure will result to direct double taxation in a way that the taxing measure already becomes highly oppressive and confiscatory, then there is an infringement of the due process clause. Okay, what is direct double taxation again? Direct double taxation is also called double taxation in the strict sense. And it will be considered, or the taxing measure will result to direct double taxation if there will be taxes that are being imposed on the same subject matter for the same purpose by the same taxing authority within the same taxing jurisdiction for the same taxing periods and of the same kind and character. So the moment that the taxing authorities are different, if the taxing authorities are different such that one is a local government unit and the other one is a national government, there exists no direct double taxation, but there is an indirect double taxation which is not constitutionally prescribed. Okay, what if one taxing authority is the Republic of the Philippines and another taxing authority is another state, such as the United States of America? Then in this case, there is international duplicate taxation, which is a type of indirect taxation. Again, being in the nature of an indirect double taxation or double taxation in the broad sense, it will not infringe any constitutional provisions. Another constitutional limitation that I'd like to remind you about would be constitutional tax exemptions. There are two pertinent provisions which you need to remember, namely Section 28.3, Article 6 of the 1987 Constitution. Please take note that this constitutional provision may be used only when the problem involves real property tax exemption. Hindi nyo po pwedeng gagamitin ito pag ang tanong ay income tax exemption, no? This provision may be utilized only when the problem involves real property tax exemption. Take note, in this constitutional provision, no, what is covered is real property taxation. So that means that the tax is being imposed on the land, building, or improvement. Another point that you need to remember under this constitutional provision is the fact that ownership is not material. Kasi hodang taxable entity ang registered owner ng property na yan, hindi ba? Because what is material in the grant of tax exemption under Section 28.3, Article 6 of the 1987 Constitution is the usage of the property, the manner on how the property has been used. If the property has been actually, directly, and exclusively used for either religious, educational, or charitable purposes, then the property is exempt from tax, meaning the property will not be subject to real property tax. Okay. Now, please take note that the phrase actually, directly, and exclusively means solely. So if it means solely, then this means that if the property has been incidentally used for either religious, educational, or charitable purposes, it will no longer be covered by the tax exemption. Another provision which you need to take note of is Section 4.3, Article 14 of the 1987 Constitution. Section 4.3, Article 14 of the 1987 Constitution deals with the tax exemption of non-stock, non-profit educational institutions. Take note, you may not use this provision if the problem does not involve a non-stock, non-profit educational institution. You may only hinge your argument on this constitutional provision if the problem involves the income earned by a non-stock, non-profit educational institution or an asset owned by a non-stock, non-profit educational institution. And therefore, ownership is material under Section 4.3, Article 14, but that's not the only element. No? In order for the revenue or the asset to be exempt from taxes and duties, the revenue or the asset must be actually, directly, and exclusively used for educational purposes. Hindi REEC purposes, no, but rather educational purposes. So here's the tip. My tip is, since ownership is not material, okay, since ownership is not material under Section 28.3, Article 6, and if the problem in the bar examination involves real property tax exemption, wag nyo na pong gamitin ang Section 4.3, Article 14. Immediately jump to Section 28.3, Article 6, because anyway, it also covers properties being used for educational purposes. Now, the tax exemption under Section 4.3, Article 14 must be harmonized with Section 30 of the NIRC. Section 30 of the NIRC enumerates the entities which shall be exempt from income tax. Take note, Section 30 of the NIRC deals with income tax exemption. Take note of the type of tax that I had mentioned. It's income tax, no? It's income tax exemption. And under Section 30 of the NIRC, there are two rules that must be complied with: organizational test and operational test. Organizational test would simply mean that the entity should have been created pursuant to Section 30. Ano ang common denominator sa Section 30? All of them are non-stock, non-profit. Diba? Lahat sila non-profit. Okay. Ano yung pangalawa? Ang covered dyan, educational, religious, charitable, social welfare institution, may kasama pang government educational institution. So if they were established pursuant to any of these purposes enumerated under Section 30, automatically check na yung organizational test. But that's not enough because there's another test which is called operational test. Okay. Under operational test, the income should be sourced from activities for which the establishment has been created. Okay, so pagka-educational purpose yan, ibig sabihin nun, yung income should have been derived from the activities of an educational institution. So what is material in the grant of tax exemption under Section 30 would be the source of the income and not the usage of the income. In fact, the second paragraph of Section 30 states that regardless of the disposition made of such income, if the income has been sourced from an activity conducted for profit or any property, whether real or personal, the income will be subject to tax. In short, kahit paano pa nagamit yung income, no, hindi magmamatter. Kaya nagamit yan for religious purposes, hindi magmamatter. Charitable, hindi magmamatter. Ano lang ang magmamatter under Section 30? Ang magmamatter lang under Section 30 would be the source of the income. It should be sourced from an activity for which it has been created pursuant to Section 30. That's the operational test. But take note that the second paragraph of Section 30 is inoperative, no? Insofar as non-stock, non-profit educational institutions are concerned, if the income has been sourced from the activity, if the income has been used for educational purposes. Kasi, di ba sa Section 30, ang kailangan lang saan kinita, di ba? Pag kinita ay activity from which it has been established, meaning educational activity, exempt ka agad yan, regardless of the disposition made of such income. Pero pagdating sa Constitution, ang tanong dyan ay, paano nagamit ang income? Was it actually directly and exclusively used for educational purposes? If yes, then it's exempt under Section 4.3, Article 14. So you can see here that you need to take a look at two legal bases when it comes to income of non-stock, non-profit educational institutions. Kasi halimbawa, the problem involves, which has already been asked in the previous bar examination, the income has been sourced from tuition fees, and then there's an income source from rent, being paid by concessionaires. Okay. Yung income source from tuition fee, hindi mo na dapat i-qualify na if they are used for educational purpose. Hindi na kailangan yun. Bakit hindi na kailangan yun? Because the income from tuition fees is exempt under Section 30. Bakit? Because the income has been sourced from an activity related to the purpose for which it has been established, which is educational institution, and it is non-stock, diba? Non-profit, I mean. So, looking at Section 30, pasado na siya agad exempt, regardless of the disposition made of such income. Ngayon, paano kung yung rental income? This time, the rental income, okay, has been sourced from an activity conducted for profit. Kasi pinaupa yung property, di ba? Okay. Can it be exempt under Section 30? No, because it's an income derived from an activity conducted for profit. But can it be exempt under the Constitution? Yes. If the income derived from the concessionaires will be actually directly and exclusively used for educational purpose. Now, the tax exemption in this particular case is not made pursuant to Section 30 of the NIRC. Rather, it is made pursuant to Section 4.3, Article 14 of the 1987 Constitution. But take note, ito ay mag-a-apply lang kung non-stock, non-profit educational institution. Kasi ang Section 4.3, Article 14 will apply only to revenue and assets of non-stock, non-profit educational institution. So, if the entity is not a non-stock, non-profit educational institution, paano kung non-stock, non-profit charitable institution siya? Section 4.3, Article 14 cannot be utilized in your argument. Rather, you just focus on the two tests, organizational test and operational test. So on your table, I had summarized these rules that I had just discussed. If the question deals with an income derived from activities pursuant to Section 30 of the NIRC, and if the problem involves the income earned by a non-stock, non-profit educational institution, exempt. If it talks about other entities enumerated under Section 30, exempt, kasi may compliance sa organizational and operational test. REC institutions, well, basically, hindi kasama ang proprietary educational institution dyan, di ba? So, in order for it to be exempt, dapat non-stock. Okay, non-stock, non-profit. So, dapat non-profit tong religious, non-profit tong educational, non-profit yung charitable. The moment that the educational institution is classified as a proprietary educational institution, it's no longer exempt, no? But the income is subject to preferential tax rates. What if the income has been derived from an activity conducted for profit? Now, for all other entities except non-stock, non-profit educational institution, the income is subject to tax. No? But if the problem involves a non-stock, non-profit educational institution, then obviously, you have to qualify. If the problem is silent, you have to qualify as to the manner on how the revenue has been used. Because if the revenue has been utilized actually directly and exclusively for educational purposes, then it will be exempt. Not pursuant to Section 30, but rather pursuant to Section 4.3, Article 14 of the 1987 Constitution. Now, for real properties, take a look at the manner on how the real property has been used. Was it used for religious purpose, for educational purpose, for charitable purpose? If the answer is in the affirmative, then the property shall be exempt from tax. Okay. Another highlight that I'd like to remind you about will deal with the inherent limitation about the tax exemption of the government. Please take note that this inherent limitation shall pertain only to the state. The tax exemption will not pertain to instrumentalities. It will also not pertain to political subdivisions with respect to the income earned from proprietary activities. But take note that based on our existing and applicable laws, instrumentalities are exempt from tax. Local government units with respect to income earned from their governmental functions, exercise of governmental functions, shall also be exempt from tax. That's pursuant to Section 32B of the NIRC. Now, in which case, it's crucial for us to determine whether an entity is an instrumentality or a GOCC. Because a GOCC as a general rule is subject to tax, not unless the charter provides for a tax exemption. And the tax exemption has to be explicit, diba? It has to be explicitly provided in the charter of the GOCC. In the case of LRTA versus City of Pasay, the Supreme Court revisited its decision, its 2009 decision regarding the classification of LRTA as a GOCC. Ano nangyari? Para magchichismisan lang tayo, magchismisan tayo. Doon sa unang case ni LRTA, 2009 case, alam niyo sabi doon? Sabi doon, GOCC daw, si LRTA, GOCC. O di obviously dahil GOCC siya, subject siya to real property tax because the charter does not provide for tax exemption. You know, that ruling has been revisited in the June 21, 2022 case of LRTA. Anong nangyari dito? Sabi, ang LRTA daw ay hindi GOCC. Ang LRTA ay isang instrumentality. Why? Because it is neither a stock nor a non-stock. Please take note that in order for an entity to be considered a GOCC, it is necessary that it is created either as a stock or a non-stock corporation. Ito, LRTA is neither a stock because the shares are, the capital stock is not divided into shares, nor a non-stock corporation. And so, performing quasi-public functions. No? And so, Supreme Court held that LRTA is an instrumentality. Anong effect na instrumentality siya? Dahil instrumentality siya, the properties of LRTA are exempt from tax. The properties of the Republic of the Philippines being managed by LRTA, which is a non-taxable entity, is exempt from tax. However, the portion of the LRTA properties that LRTA leases to private entities are not exempt from real estate tax. Because in this particular case, the beneficial use has already been granted to a taxable entity. Now, in that discussion, I had discussed Section 234A of the Local Government Code as well. Now, let's move on to income tax. For income tax, you need to remember the requisites of taxable income. There has to be gain earned. Sa problem naman, usually given na yan eh. The gain is realized and then the gain must not be excluded by law. Please take note that for me, if we'll talk about the bigger picture of things, you need to include this classification of the taxpayer. Why should the classification of the taxpayer be material? Because there are taxpayers who or which will be subject to tax only if the income has been sourced within. Please take note that under Section 23 of the NIRC, only resident citizens and domestic corporations are subject to tax for their worldwide income. Meaning, whether the income has been sourced within or without, the income will be subject to tax, provided, of course, that such income is not exempt under the NIRC or other special laws. What else are the differences between all these taxpayers? Well, there's one taxpayer who is not individual taxpayer, who is not allowed or who is not entitled to allowable deductions. And this taxpayer is a non-resident alien not engaged in trade or business. Because a non-resident alien not engaged in trade or business shall be subject to 25% final withholding tax based on his or her gross income. Okay. And since the income is subject to final withholding tax, the non-resident alien not engaged in trade or business will not file any return, diba? Because it is the withholding agent who shall file a tax return. Okay. Now, with respect to corporate taxpayers, please remember that only a domestic corporation shall be subject to tax based on its worldwide income. All the other corporate taxpayers shall be subject to tax only if the income has been sourced within. And there is one corporate taxpayer that is not entitled to allowable deductions. And which entity is this? A non-resident foreign corporation. A non-resident foreign corporation is subject to 25% final withholding tax based on its gross income. With all this being said, with you noting that all taxpayers except resident, citizen, and domestic corporation shall be subject to tax only with respect to the income sourced within, it is important for you to note where is the situs of the income. Situs is governed by Section 42 of the NIRC. And situs of the tax will entirely depend on the type of income earned. If the income earned is in the nature of an interest or interest income, then the situs is the place of residence of the debtor, yung umutang, hindi yung nagpautang. Hindi yung kumita ng interest income, but rather yung reason kung bakit siya nagka-interest income. With respect to income derived from service, the situs would be the place where the service was rendered, not the place where the payment has been made, not the place where the payee is domiciled, but rather the place where the service was rendered. In fact, in the case of Bayer Nickel versus CIR, the Supreme Court had emphasized that the place of payment the place of execution of the contract, the place where the place of residence of the payer are not material in determining the situs of the tax, because what is material is the place where the service has been rendered. With respect to sale of real property, it would be the place where the property is located. With respect to sale of personal property, you need to check whether the problem indicates that the taxpayer is the one who or which produced the property being sold. Siya rin ba ang nag-manufacture ng item? Kasi kung siya rin ang nag-manufacture ng item, then there are two places which you need to consider. The place of sale and the place of production. If the place of production is outside the Philippines and the place of sale is in the Philippines, then it's partly within and partly without, and vice versa. But if the place of sale and the place of production are both in the Philippines, then obviously that's entirely sourced within. Okay? Now, another aspect that I'd like to remind you about under income taxation would be the principle about secondment arrangements. For secondment arrangement, please note that in order for an individual to be considered a non-resident citizen, okay, the individual must have an employment abroad. Section 22 defined non-resident citizen as with the following elements. Isasabihin ko na lang na parang element type para natatandaan nyo na checklist, yung checklist, no? 1, syempre dapat citizen siya ng Philippines, diba? Pangalawa, the source of the income should be abroad. Okay? Meaning, dahil nga kung service yan, the service should be rendered abroad. Third, the employment must be in abroad. Okay? Sabi, employment thereat. O, ibig sabihin, employment is abroad. Okay? And lastly, the physical presence abroad must be most of the time during the taxable year. O parang nawala na pala ako ng kamay. O sige, ganyan ko. Okay. O ngayon, the place, nawala ako dahil bigla akong nawala ng kamay. O, punta tayo dun sa ano ulit. Ano yung fourth? The individual must be physically present abroad most of the time. And the term most of the time means more than 183 days. Saan nakuha naman yung 183 days? Yan yung 365 divided by 2, 182.5. Round it off, 183. So the individual should have stayed abroad most of the time during the taxable year. Okay. Take note that in order for there to be employment abroad, there should be a separate and distinct entity abroad, no, having control over the individual. Okay. Kasi halimbawa, kung domestic corporation ng employer niya, pinadala siya abroad, domestic employer, yung employer niya, domestic corporation, pinadala siya abroad, okay, sa isang parent company nitong domestic corporation, and during the time, sabi mo na 2 years siya doon sa 2-year period, ang nagmo-monitor ng task niya ay yung parent company which is a separate entity, then in that example, there is an employment abroad. Diba? Bakit importanteng malaman kung merong employment abroad in cases of secondment arrangements? Because it is material in determining whether the individual is a resident citizen or a non-resident citizen. Okay. Tingnan natin dun sa 1999 bar. Dito merong Philippine Corporation, and the Philippine Corporation is the employer. No? P is the employee. P was sent to a subsidiary abroad, okay, for an indefinite period of time. So, the subsidiary is a separate and distinct entity from that of the Philippine Corporation, di ba? Dito, sinong nagbabayad ng salary? Si Philippine Corporation. Okay. Sino nagbabayad ng housing, cost of living, educational allowance? Yung Hong Kong company. Okay, so yung sahod, si Philippine Corporation, other benefits, Hong Kong company. Tingnan natin. It's crucial for you to determine whether the person is a non-resident citizen, because if he is, then only the income sourced within the Philippines will be subject to tax. Then it will also lead to the conclusion that all these benefits, including the salary, will not be subject to tax because this is an income derived from a service rendered abroad. So let's check. Citizen? Check. Okay. Ano yung pangalawa? Sourced abroad yung income? Yes. The services were rendered abroad. Okay. Third, stayed most of the time during the taxable year? Yes, indefinite period. Fourth, was there employment abroad? Yes, because for secondment arrangements, the entity which exercises control over, no, over the individual shall be deemed the employer for purposes of classifying the individual as either a resident citizen or a non-resident citizen. So the answer to this question would be that all the salaries and allowances shall not be subject to tax, being that the taxpayer P is a non-resident citizen who will be subject to tax only for the income source within. Now, on this slide, you can see here that I had already given you a summary of the tax implication, just so when there's a question dealing with whether it's subject to normal tax or final tax, you would know. Okay. So dito nakasulat na yung tax implication and then those items that are exempt para madali yung memory work, no? So this is your memory aid. You can just take a screenshot of it, no, after the session, or you may take a screenshot now. Please take note that I'd like to emphasize that de minimis benefits are small benefits given for the contentment and goodwill of the employees, and these benefits are exempt from tax as long as they fall within the threshold amount provided under the revenue regulation. Also remember employer's convenience rule. If the benefit is granted to an employee, okay, but the benefit will indeed redound to the employer, no, not really the employee, then the benefit will not be considered a taxable income on the part of the employee. Halimbawa, binigyan siya ng housing benefit. Binigyan siya ng housing benefit para maging on-call siya. Matawag siya any time of the day. Okay. Ibig sabihin nun, kung titignan mo, hindi yan talaga para dun sa benepisyo nung employee. Para yan sa benefit ng employer para matawag niya yung employee niya any time of the day. So in which case, the value of the housing, no, will not form part of the taxable income of the employee by virtue of the employer's convenience rule. Okay. 13th month pay and other benefits shall be exempt only to the extent of 90,000. Any amount in excess thereof shall be subject to tax. For retirement pay, alam niyo sa bar, laging may reasonable private benefit plan. Pag silent yung question, lagyan mo na lang on the assumption that there exists a reasonable private benefit plan. Okay. The retirement benefit will be exempt from tax if it will comply with the following requisites. First, the retiree must be at least 50 years of age at the time of the retirement. The retiree should have completed 10 years in service, whether intermittent or continuous. And the retiree should have availed of this tax exemption only once. If all the three requisites concur, then the retirement benefit is not taxable. For separation pay, no, if the separation is by reason of death, physical disability, or any cause beyond the control of the employee, then the separation pay is not taxable. If the separation pay has been received by reason of a resignation, taxable yan because it's not a cause beyond the control of the employee. Also, please take note that if you use the normal tax table, no, schedular tax table under section 24A of the NIRC, if the taxable income amounts to 250,000 pesos or less, basta subject to normal tax, normal tax dapat, exempt yan sa tax. Ngayon, prices. For prices, ano yung taxable? Ay, ano yung non-taxable? Yun na lang. Ano yung non-taxable? If the prices were given by virtue of a religious, educational, charitable, literary, artistic, civic, or scientific achievement, and the recipient will not be required to render future substantial services, exempt. Sa sports, basta yung competition sanctioned by the Philippine Olympics Commission, exempt. Okay. Winnings, isa lang ang exempt, Lotto and PCSO, provided that the amount of Lotto or PCSO winning would be 10,000 pesos or less. And then, interest income earned from dollar or other foreign currency deposit accounts will be exempt if earned by non-resident. Later, I will talk about tax-free exchange, no? I'd like to focus on tax-free exchange, but I'd like to discuss deductions first. For deductions, please take note that deductions can be utilized by taxpayer earning income from business, trade, or profession. So tingnan mo muna kung self-employed yung taxpayer dun sa problem. Because if the taxpayer earned compensation income, then the taxpayer is not entitled to allowable deductions. There are two types of allowable deductions: itemized deductions and optional standard deduction. Itemized deductions do not have any limit except representation expense. May limit yan. It should not exceed 1% of the net receipts or 0.5% of the net sales. Okay? Pag nag-exceed, unreasonable yung amount, hindi pwedeng i-deduct. Optional standard deduction, on the other hand, is a theoretical amount, no? Limited to 40% of the gross sales or gross receipts in cases of individual taxpayers, or 40% of the gross income in cases of corporate taxpayers. Please take note that if the deduction is in the nature of an optional standard deduction, walang substantiation requirement. Hindi kailangan ng resibo. Wala ring requisites of deductibility. Unlike itemized deduction na kailangan may requisites, compliance siya with all the requisites of deductibility provided under Section 34 of the NIRC, and dapat substantiated by official receipts and other supporting documents. Okay. I'd like to highlight CREATE law with respect to corporate taxpayers. Okay. With respect to corporate taxpayers, please take note that for domestic corporations lang to for domestic corporations, no, a lower rate of 20% based on the taxable income will be imposed if the two conditions exist. What are the two conditions? First, the net taxable income must be equivalent to 5 million or less. And, yung conjunction na and the total assets, no, is equivalent to 100 million or less. If both conditions exist, then the lower rate of 20% shall apply. The lower rate of 20% shall apply. Paano kung compliant pagdating sa amount ng taxable income, pero hindi compliant pagdating doon sa amount ng total assets? O, edi 25%. Compliant pagdating sa taxable income, pero compliant pagdating sa total assets, pero sa taxable income hindi. 25%. Because in order for a domestic corporation to be subject to a lower rate of 20%, dapat both conditions exist. Okay, now, minimum corporate income tax is applicable to both domestic and resident foreign corporations. Please take note that it will apply beginning on the 4th taxable year, immediately following the year in which the corporation commenced its operations. Commencement of business operations would mean the year when it has registered with the BIR. Okay, ngayon. Para madali ang bilangan, 5th year yan. Kasi nga, 4th year immediately following the year in which the corporation commenced its operations, diba? So, year 0 actually yung year 1. So, technically, year 5 yan. For 4 years, no, the corporation will not pay any minimum corporate income tax. Grace period yan. Okay. Please take note that under the CREATE law, a resident foreign corporation is not subject to a lower rate of 20%. Available lang yon pag domestic corporation. Because for resident foreign corporation, the rate is fixed at 25%. Also, please take note that the interest rate imposed on the interest income earned from expanded foreign currency deposit unit is now pegged at the rate of 15% based on the final withholding tax. Now, what about regional operating headquarters? Nandito yan sa dulo, regional operating headquarters. The rate now is pegged at 25%. Dati 10%. Now it's 25%. Now, let me discuss this particular case of SHINCO. SHINCO is a Philippine Registered Representative Office of a foreign corporation, which was registered under the laws of Japan. This foreign corporation is licensed in the Philippines as a representative has a license to operate a representative office in the Philippines. And during the year, Shinko received subsidies from the head office, nakatanggap. So ang tanong dito sa case na to, is Shinko liable for income tax and VAT for the period? The answer is, the amounts considered by the CIR as Shinko's income actually came from the subsidies remitted by the head office. And since these are remittances, they cannot be classified as an income. Diba? Kasi para siya maging income, dapat may rendition of service. Eh dito, wala namang ni-render na service yung branch office. Diba? And otherwise, it will also be taxing itself kasi head office to branch office yun eh. And so, the remittances, no, or the subsidies cannot be considered as a gain realized by Shinko, and hence it cannot be subject to income tax because the remittances can be regarded only as part of the capital. Now, finally, I'd like to discuss tax-free exchange. Tax-free exchange has been asked in the 2018 and 2019 bar exams, no? And basically, the requisites in order that there be tax-free exchange are enumerated on your slide. The transferee must be a corporation. The transferee exchanges its shares of stocks for properties of the transferor. The transfer is made by a person acting alone or together with others, not exceeding 4. And lastly, as a result of the exchange, the transferor, alone or together with others, but not exceeding 4, gains control of the transferee. So dapat yung tumatanggap ng property ay laging korporasyon. Kasi ang kapalit ng property ay shares of stocks. Okay, ngayon, pwede bang real property for shares of stocks? Pwede. Pwede bang personal property for shares of stocks? Pwede. Okay, next question. Kailangan po ba ng prior confirmatory ruling from the BIR in order that it will be considered a tax-free exchange? Not necessary. No? Lusoko case involving Carrela and Pure Gold. Dito, ang pinag-swap, shares ni Carrela para sa shares ni Pure Gold. Okay. Ngayon, pag naglipat tayo ng real property tax sa isang korporasyon, no? 4 tayo. O sige, 5 na lang para yung maximum number. 5 lang ang maximum number ha, hindi 6. Sabi dyan, the transferor either alone or together with others. Ilan yung others? 4. So, a max of 5 transferors. Kunwari, 5 tayo. Okay. May properties tayo. Ay, co-owned properties, no? Tayo nakapangalan dun sa property. Nilipat natin dun sa korporasyon, iisang deed. Okay. And together, no? Tayong 5, pag inad yung mga interest natin dun sa corporation, meron na tayong control. Is that a tax-free exchange? Yes. Okay. Ang kailangan lang merong control. And what is control? The transferor should obtain at least 51% of the total voting power, no? Total stocks entitled to vote of that corporation. Next question, Lusoko issue. Sina Lusoko together with 4 others, meron na silang control dun sa corporation prior to the exchange. So ang tanong, tax-free exchange pa rin ba siya kahit may control na nga sila before the exchange? The answer is yes. Walang sinabi sa batas na dapat wala silang control prior to the exchange. There's no qualification in Section 40C. So ano lang kailangan? Ang kailangan lang meron silang control after the exchange. It is not material whether they have or have no control prior to the exchange. Okay, so that's tax-free exchange. Now, let's talk about administrative requirements. That's the end of the substantive portion of income taxation. Let's talk about the admin requirements. With respect to admin requirements, please take note that as a general rule, all taxpayers are required to file income tax returns except non-resident alien not engaged in trade or business. However, please take note of the following instances when the individual is not required to file any return. By the way, letter B and letter D are the same, no? B and D refers to substituted filing. B and D refers to substituted filing. Ang pagkakaiba lang, yung nasa letter B, hindi siya minimum wage earner. Yung nasa letter D, walang letter yan. kulay lang, yung nasa pinakahuli, minimum wage earner. But both must comply with the requisites of substituted filing, which I will discuss later. Okay. Punta tayo ngayon dun sa una. Sa una, okay, as long as the total compensation income does not exceed 250,000 pesos, hindi kailangan mag-file ng return. Okay. Kailangan bang iisa lang ang employer? Hindi. Substituted filing yun, kung yun ang iniisip mo. Under the first instance, hindi kailangang iisa yung employer. Ano lang ang importante? Purely compensation income earner, and then the total taxable income from compensation will not exceed 250,000 pesos. So, halimbawa, security guard siya, tas dalawa ang employer niya, total taxable income does not exceed 250,000. Required bang mag-file ng income tax return? Answer, no. Kahit dalawa ang employer. Why? Under this instance. Not under substituted filing, but under item A. Okay. In which case, what are the elements of substituted filing? In order for an individual taxpayer to be qualified under substituted filing, it is necessary that the individual must be a purely compensation income earner. Okay. Ibig sabihin, hindi siya kumita ng income from business. Okay. What else? There has to be one employer only. Iisa lang dapat ang employer niya. Okay. What else? The taxes had been correctly withheld. Paano kung dalawang employer? Dalawang employer niya, hindi qualified under substituted filing. Paano kung ganito? January to June 2022, A corporation ang employer. July to December, B corporation. Qualified ba under substituted filing? Hindi. Bakit? Dalawa ang employer niya, consecutively. Hindi kailangang simultaneously yun eh. O, paano kung ganito? January to June, may employer siya, A corporation. July to December, may negosyo siya. O, edi during the taxable year, he is classified as a mixed income earner because he also earned income from business, trade, or profession. And therefore, this individual is required to file an income tax return, not qualified under substituted filing. Let's talk about value-added tax return. As I mentioned earlier, in order for a transaction to be subject to value-added tax return tuloy na sabi ko, value-added tax, the transaction must involve sale, barter, exchange, or lease of goods or services in the ordinary course of trade or business. Pag importation of goods, hindi kailangang in the ordinary course of business. Subject pa rin siya sa VAT kahit hindi in the ordinary course. And therefore, if the sale is not made in the ordinary course of business, then VAT cannot be imposed. Okay. Example, SAM case. SAM was created by law it's actually an agency of the government, and it is tasked to dispose of assets of hydroelectric power plant operators which cease business operations. So, gano'n lang ang gawa niya, mandate by law. Sabi ng Korte Suprema, yung sale by SAM, which is an agency of the government, is not subject to VAT, not because it is an agency of the government, but rather because the sale is not made in the ordinary course of trade or business, but rather it's by virtue of a mandate of a law. Now, in the 2023 case, January 17, 2023 case of Lapanday Food Corporation versus CIR, ang question dito ay, will the interest income arising from intercompany loans be considered as subject to VAT? Kasi dito, may mga affiliates, yung mga corporations, affiliates sila. Tapos nagkaroon sila ng loan, nag-extend sila ng loan sa isa't isa. And then, the loans were subject to interest income. In this case, the Supreme Court held that the interest income is not subject to value-added tax because the loans granted to the affiliates are not pursuant to the business, not even incidental to the business. And therefore, the interest income is not subject to value-added tax. There are different kinds of transactions subject to VAT, namely VAT taxable transactions or those transactions subject to 12% VAT. Zero-rated transactions, which can be classified as export sales kapag ka merong pinapadalang goods abroad to be consumed abroad. Cross-border doctrine dictates that if the goods are to be consumed abroad, no value-added tax must be imposed thereon. Okay. What else? Foreign currency denominated transaction. in order for a transaction to be considered as foreign currency denominated transaction, no, what are the requisites? First, the service should be rendered in favor of a non-resident client, meaning a client not engaged in business in the Philippines. Second, the service has to be paid for in foreign currency in accordance with BSP rules and regulations. Kung sa problem ay sinabing inward remittance, agad, in accordance with BSP rules and regulations yan. Okay? And then third, the service must be performed in the Philippines. If all these three elements are complied with, then there exists a foreign currency denominated transaction. Okay. So ako ang tanong, entitled ba siya to zero rating? Ang sagot is yes. If the transaction will be qualified under any of this, no? And lastly, effectively zero-rated transaction. Effectively zero-rated transaction is one where the entity transacted with another entity which is exempt from indirect taxes. Okay, effectively zero-rated yan. Provided that there is a provision in the special law or international agreement which effectively subjects the transaction to a zero rate, such as a provision which likewise exempt the suppliers from the indirect tax. Okay, so hindi enough na yung entity, yung buyer ay exempt. Hindi enough yon. Dapat merong provision under the special law which likewise grant exemption to the seller. Okay, dapat ganun siya. Okay, now, for VAT-exempt transaction, just remember that sale of agricultural food products sold in their original state shall be exempt. Revenues of non-stock, non-profit educational institutions shall be exempt from tax, no? As long as they were earned from tuition fees or they had been actually directly and exclusively used for educational purpose. Now, let's take a look at a 2022 case. No, it's the case of Macquarie. In this particular case, Macquarie is a multinational company organized and existing under the laws of Australia. Okay. Now, it is licensed to do business as a regional operating headquarters in the Philippines, and its services are paid for in Australian dollars. Now, in this particular case, in the course of the operations of Macquarie, no, Macquarie purchased goods and services, and then it paid the VAT for that. So, Macquarie principally rendered services to Macquarie Financial Holdings, an entity registered under the laws of the Australia. So, si Macquarie, nag-render siya ng service for Macquarie Financial. Question: will the service be qualified as a zero-rated transaction? Tingnan natin. Were the service rendered in the Philippines? Yes, di ba? May regional operating headquarters siya sa Philippines. So, check. Okay, service rendered in the Philippines. Check. Second, was it rendered in favor of a non-resident client? Answer, check. It was rendered in favor of Macquarie Financial, which is not registered with the SEC, meaning no license to do business in the Philippines. And then third, was it paid for in foreign currency in accordance with BSP rules and regulations? Yes. And therefore, it's 2021. In this 2021 case of CIR versus Macquarie, the Supreme Court held that the transaction is classified as a zero-rated transaction. Now, another aspect that I'd like to mention would be that the threshold amount. The transaction will be subject to VAT if the gross sales or gross receipts exceeds 3 million pesos. However, if the problem involves a residential lot, the selling price per unit, meaning per lot, must exceed 1.5 million pesos in order that such sale shall be subject to VAT. If the sale involves a capital asset, obviously, hindi mo i-apply to. Diba? Why? Please take note that in cases of sale of properties, no, you need to take note of whether the property is a capital asset or an ordinary asset. If the property is a capital asset, the sale thereof will be subject to capital gains tax if it's a real property, or normal tax if it's a personal property. If it's an ordinary asset, the sale of the real property will be subject to normal tax. The sale of a personal property is subject to normal tax as well. But not only that, if the sale involves an ordinary asset, the sale will likewise be subject to business tax, either other percentage tax or value-added tax. So kung yung binenta niya ay more than 3 million, obviously, at ordinary asset siya ha, subject to VAT. Ngayon, pag ordinary asset siya, at residential lot siya, more than 3 million ang sales niya for the entire year, hindi mo agad i-conclude na subject to VAT. Titignan mo muna kung magkano yung selling price for each lot. Because the selling price must be more than 1.5 million in order for it to be subject to VAT. If it's a residential house and lot or a condominium unit, no, the sale must be, gross selling price must be more than 3,199,200 in order for it to be subject to VAT. Okay. That ends value-added tax. Let's take a look at taxing authority. For taxing authority of the BIR, please take note of Section 4 of the NIRC. There are two types of duties under Section 4, quasi-legislative and then quasi-judicial. Quasi-legislative would mean the interpretation of tax laws. That's the power to interpret tax laws. Quasi-judicial is the power to decide disputed assessments, refunds, other matters arising under the NIRC and other laws being administered by the BIR, or decisions about penalties imposed under the law. So, we call this quasi-judicial. One needs to determine whether the problem involves the exercise of quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial because if the CIR performed a quasi-legislative function, then the appellate body is the Secretary of Finance. Non-compliance with this rule will result to the dismissal of the case filed in court. Failure to comply with the doctrine of exhaustion of administrative remedies. Case in point, Courage versus CIR. If the function performed by the CIR is a quasi-judicial function, then the proper appellate body is the Court of Tax Appeals. Okay? Now, remedies. If we talk about tax remedies, just remember about the jurisdiction of the CTA. Let's just have an overview. Based on the bar syllabus, of course. Excuse me. Please take note that the CTA has jurisdiction over decisions of the CIR involving drop cases. I'm the only one who has the power to use drop. Alam niyo na, disputed assessment, yun. Okay. It may also involve in actions of the CIR involving drop cases, provided that the law deems the inaction as an implied denial. Hindi porket inaction ni CIR ay implied denial na. Perfect example. Inaction of the CIR with respect to administrative claims for refund of unutilized input VAT is not considered as an implied denial pursuant to Section 112A as amended by the Train Law. Another example. Inaction is not immediately considered as an implied denial in cases of inactions dealing with disputed assessments under Section 228 of the NIRC. Because in the case of Lascona versus CIR, the Supreme Court held that the taxpayer has two options in cases when there is an inaction during the 180-day period granted to the CIR to act on the protest. And what are the two options? Either to await for the decision or to treat the 180-day period as an implied denial. So you see in this rule, it's the option of the taxpayer. Okay. The CTA will also acquire jurisdiction over decisions of the Regional Trial Court in local tax cases and the decisions of the CBAA or Central Board of Assessment Appeals in cases of real property taxes. Now, let me start with the first two items under the jurisdiction of the CTA, particularly disputed assessment. There will only be considered a disputed assessment if the taxpayer filed a protest, whether in the nature of a request for reconsideration or a request for reinvestigation. Take note that the process of assessment starts with the filing of a return. That's also called self-assessment. Okay. After the filing of a return, the BIR will examine. Diba? Revenue officers will examine the books of accounts. But take note take note, in order for the revenue officers to examine the books of accounts, the revenue officers must be armed with a letter of authority. They must be armed with a letter of authority. If there is no letter of authority, then the assessment notice issued pursuant to the investigation shall be considered as a void assessment, infringement of the due process clause. If the letter of authority names a certain revenue officer, and the named revenue officer is not the one who conducted the audit, any assessment issued pursuant to such investigation is void. Infringement of the due process clause. Dalawang cases na yan eh. Merong 2023 case na ganon ulit, tapos meron na namang 2022 case na ganon. McDonald's yata yung isa. Parang nangyari, kunwari, Mr. A yung nakapangalan sa letter of authority, so sabi siya ang mag-e-examine, na-reassign siya to another RDO, and instead of issuing a new letter of authority, walang inisyu na bagong letter of authority. So si Mr. A ang nakapangalan, pero ang nag-examine ng books of accounts si Mr. B. Tas may inisyu na assessment notice thereafter. Ang sagot doon, void assessment notice. No? Why? Violation of due process clause. Okay. Next. After the issuance of a letter of authority and examination of the books of accounts, the revenue district officer will issue a notice of discrepancy. If there is no notice of discrepancy issued, violation ulit yan ng due process clause. Now, thereafter, the regional director or the CIR, depending on sino ang may hawak ng kaso, no, will issue a preliminary assessment notice. The issuance of a preliminary assessment notice is mandatory. There are exceptions provided under Section 228, such as when the error appears on the face of the return, so hindi na kailangan ng PAN. However, as a general rule, pag wala sa problem na part siya nung exceptions under Section 228, issuance of PAN is mandatory. In fact, the PAN must also indicate the facts, the law, the jurisprudence, the rules and regulations upon which the PAN is based. Otherwise, the PAN is void. So if the PAN is void, then the FAN is void. Bakit? Because the issuance of a PAN is mandatory. Okay, another case. Sabi ng Supreme Court, pag dinispute ni taxpayer yung receipt of the PAN, sabi niya, wala akong natanggap na PAN. Okay. And the BIR cannot establish that indeed the taxpayer received the PAN. It is deemed as if PAN was never issued. Therefore, any PAN issued thereafter shall be void. Okay. Meron pang isang case. Upon receipt of the PAN, the taxpayer is granted 15 days to file a reply. Not protest, but a reply. Ang nangyari, nag-issue ng FAN within the 15-day period. By 2023 case din na ganito, nag-issue ng FAN within the 15-day period. Alam niyo effect nun? FAN is void. Because the 15-day period should have been granted to the taxpayer. Otherwise, violation of due process clause. Oh, another case, recent jurisprudence na naman. Inisyu yung PAN. Okay, inisyu yung PAN. Sabi mo, January 2022. Inisyu yung FAN, February na 2022. So more than 1 month na yung nakalipas, no? Ayun lang, sabay na na-receive ni taxpayer. The taxpayer received the PAN and the FAN on the same day. Question, is the FAN valid? No. Why? Because the 15-day period will begin to run upon the receipt of the PAN. So technically, when the taxpayer received both the PAN and the FAN on the same day, the taxpayer was deprived of the 15-day period to file a reply. O yan. So, take note of those cases. Recent jurisprudence lahat yan. Now, FAN, the validity of the FAN is necessary because the BIR cannot collect administratively without a valid FAN. No? An administrative collection must always be preceded by a valid formal assessment notice. Now, upon the filing of a protest, the CIR will be granted 180 days to decide on the protest. If there is an action within a 180-day period, it means that a final decision on disputed assessment has been issued. So, if FDDA has been issued, then the taxpayer has a period of 30 days, okay, counted from the receipt of the FDDA to file a petition for review before the CTA. Take note, the FDDA must also contain the facts, the law, the jurisprudence, the rules and regulations upon which the decision is based. So, pag walang valid decision, hindi magro-run yung 30-day period. Okay. Pwede bang mag-file ng MR before the CIR or the regional director? Pwede naman. But the 30-day period will still be counted from the receipt of the FDDA, not from the receipt of the decision on the MR. So, ang rule, count na lang lagi from FDDA. Okay. If it was the regional director who issued the decision, the taxpayer has two options. Either to file a judicial appeal by filing a petition for review before the CTA division, or file a request for reconsideration, and this is called an admin appeal, before the Commissioner of Internal Revenue. Okay, if still aggrieved by the decision of the CTA division, anong gagawin? File motion for recon or motion for new trial before the CTA division, and this is mandatory. Pag hindi ito na-comply with, the petition for review filed before the CTA and bank shall be dismissed. Okay. From CTA and bank, saan aakyat? Supreme Court, pursuant to Rule 45. Now, what if there is an inaction within the 180-day period? There are two options provided in the case of Lascona versus CIR. The first option is to await for the decision and file the necessary appeal within 30 days from the receipt of the decision. Or, treat the inaction as an implied denial and file a petition for review before the CIR within 30 days from the lapse of the 180-day period. Okay? That is if the taxpayer will treat the inaction as an implied denial. Please take note that if the inaction is by the regional director, no, there will be no admin appeal. Okay? Walang admin appeal. So, pwede bang maghintay na maghintay na maghintay? Okay, pwede. May forever. Dito lang. Okay. Ngayon, some highlights. In cases of inaction, walang admin appeal. Ano lang ang recourse? Petition for review before the CTA division pursuant to Rule 42. If there is an action, meaning a decision or a final decision on disputed assessment, it really depends on who issued the FDDA. If it was issued by the regional director, then the taxpayer has two options: file an admin appeal or file a judicial appeal. If the decision obviously has been issued by the CIR, there will be no admin appeal. Rather, the only recourse is to file a petition for review before the CTA division. Now, to highlight the discussion that I had made earlier, no, the following can be grounds in order that an assessment will be considered as void, or grounds to nullify an assessment. If there was no compliance with the procedural requirements, assessment is void. If the assessment notice merely contains the computation of the tax liability with no explanation on how the amount has been arrived at, assessment is void because it lacks the factual basis. If the assessment does not contain a definite amount of liability because the assessment indicates that the amount is still subject to modification, assessment is void. If the assessment does not contain a due date, assessment is void. If the assessment notice does not contain a demand to pay, assessment is void. Letter F has already been discussed earlier, no? Yung LOA, yung investigation has been conducted by a revenue officer not named in the LOA. UMEX has been discussed earlier. Yan yung sabay dumating yung fan and pan. Okay. Lastly, if the assessment notice was issued beyond the prescriptive period, then the assessment notice is void. Under Section 203 of the NIRC, assessment notice must be issued within 3 years from the date prescribed by law for the filing of the return, or if the return is belatedly filed, then the 3-year period will be counted from the actual date of filing. Okay. Please take note that if the problem states that the act of fraud is not indicated in the return, apply the 3-year period. if the problem indicates that there was a false or fraudulent return filed, but there was no indication that there is an intent to evade the tax, 3-year period will apply. Because the 10-year period will be applicable only when there is a failure to file, there is a false or fraudulent return filed with the intent to evade the tax where the act of fraud is indicated in the assessment notice, or if there is an omission to file a return, in which case the 10-year period will be applicable, counted from the discovery of the filing of a false or fraudulent return or the omission to file a return. Oh, so 3 or 10 lang yan, diba? Can the 3-year period be extended? Answer is yes, as long as there's a valid waiver of the statute of limitations. And this waiver of the statute of limitations must be executed prior to the lapse of the regular 3-year period. Since we are already discussing prescriptive period, let us talk about prescriptive period to collect. Ito, assess, di ba? Okay. So the government must assess within this period. Let's talk about prescriptive period to collect. If there is an assessment issued within the regular 3-year period, the government will have a period of 3 years counted from the date of assessment to collect. Okay, tanong. Kailangan bang ma-receive ni taxpayer yung assessment notice within 3 years? Yung within this 3-year period to assess, kailangan ba niyang ma-receive? Hindi. Ano lang kailangan mangyari within the 3-year period to assess? Dapat lang ma-send sa taxpayer. So kung na-receive niya beyond the 3-year period, valid pa rin ba yung assessment? Yes. Pag-collection via administrative remedy, meaning through the issuance of a warrant of distraint or levy, the warrant of distraint or levy must be served and received by the taxpayer within the 3-year period. Okay, punta tayo sa 10 years. If an assessment notice has been issued within the 10-year period, the government has 5 years from the date of assessment to collect. What if there is an assessment notice issued within a validly extended period? Then the government will have 5 years from the date of assessment to collect. Date of assessment has been described under jurisprudential tenets as the date when the assessment has been sent to the taxpayer. Take note that for the longest time, I have been reminding reviewees, that it's not 3-5, but rather 3-3. And at that time, I have been using CIR versus United Salvage and Towage to make a point. Finally, na-repeat, na-echo yung United Salvage and Towage in this CIR versus CTA case, a 2022 case. And in this particular case, the Supreme Court had explicitly mentioned that the 5-year period for collection of taxes will apply only when the extraordinary period of 10 years has been applied in cases of assessments. Okay. With respect to waiver, please take note that in order for it to be valid, it has to indicate the date of expiry and the date of execution. Okay? Hindi na kailangan i-indicate yung date of acceptance. However, the execution by the taxpayer and the acceptance by the CIR must be made before the expiration of the regular 3-year period to assess or collect. It must be signed by the taxpayer or responsible official. Hindi na kailangan may SPA as long as the person who signed is a responsible official. Who is a responsible official? A responsible official is one who participated during the conduct of the audit. Okay. And then finally, we have here waiver of collection. If the waiver signed is with respect to collection of taxes but not assessment, the waiver must also indicate the particular type of tax being assessed. Okay. Now, since we discussed NIRC, let's talk about local tax, no? Protest naman tayo ng local tax para hindi nyo na-mix up yung rules. Kanina, protest tayo under NIRC, meaning internal revenue taxes dapat yung problem. Punta tayo kung yung problem na binigay sa bar involves local tax. Pag local tax, dapat lagi ding merong notice of assessment. No? The taxpayer must file a protest within 60 days from the receipt of the notice of assessment. Pag NIRC, 30 days from receipt of the notice of assessment. Pag local tax, 60 days, no, to file a protest. Take note, this will not include RPT, ha? May iba tayong flowchart pagdating sa RPT. Ngayon, pagdating dun sa protest, saan ipa-file? Local treasurer. Is payment under protest mandatory? No. Payment under protest is mandatory only when there is an erroneous assessment of real property tax. Okay. Ilang araw meron si local treasurer to decide? 60. Si CIR, ilan kanina? 180. Diba? 180. Oh, ayun. Sa CIR, yung 180 ba ay implied denial? May option si taxpayer, di ba? Last ko na. Dito, local tax. Meron din bang option yung taxpayer? Wala. Inaction is treated as an implied denial. Okay. Therefore, if there's an inaction within the 60-day period, no, then immediately akyat agad ng RTC within 30 days, no, from the lapse of the 60-day period. From RTC, saan ang pupunta? CTA division. Why? Because RTC took cognizance of the case in its original jurisdiction. Punta tayo sa RPT. Kasi nga, kino-compare natin yung processes, di ba? So, ibig sabihin, ang crucial sa problem, tignan mo muna, ano yung tax involved? Is it an income tax? Is it a real property tax? Or is the problem involved sa a local tax? Para alam mo kung ano yung remedy. Okay, now, RPT. The remedy of the taxpayer will entirely depend on the type of assessment. Because there are two types of assessment, no, with respect to real property taxes. It can be an erroneous assessment or an illegal assessment. An erroneous assessment is one that involves a dispute on the correctness of the amount being assessed. Diba? May question ba dun sa magkano yung tax? May question ba dun sa value ng tax? Because if there's a question with respect to the value of the real property tax or whether a portion thereof should be subject to tax, or if there's a question as to the propriety of the assessment level used, erroneous assessment yan. And if the problem involves an erroneous assessment, then the taxpayer must exhaust the administrative remedies provided under the local government code. So ano ang admin remedies? Ang admin remedies ay, pag meron ng notice of assessment, pay under protest. Meron bang period to pay under protest? Wala. Walang nakasulat sa batas. Ang meron lang period is that upon payment under protest, no, within 30 days from the date of payment under protest, the taxpayer must file a protest before the local treasurer. Okay? So pay under protest and then file a protest. Okay, ngayon, anong pagkakaiba? Sa NIRC, walang payment under protest. Sa local tax, walang payment under protest. Yung 30-day period under NIRC will be counted from the receipt of the assessment. Under the local government code, pag local tax, receipt din ang notice of assessment. RPT, payment under protest. 30 days from the payment under protest. Now, local tax, ilang days to decide? 60. Dito, 60 din. Will inaction be treated as an implied denial? Yes. Okay. Local tax, akyat RTC within 30 days, correct? Okay. RPT, akyat LBAA within 60 days. LBAA or Local Board of Assessment Appeals. From LBAA, aakyat siya ng CBAA. Okay? Now, pwede bang mag-MR sa LBAA? Pwede. Okay. But you cannot apply the NAPES ruling, ha? NAPES ruling is applicable to judicial actions. So walang fresh period of 30 days to elevate it to the CBAA. Understood? Yung remaining period na lang ang period na pag-akyat ng CBAA pagka merong MR, Motion for Reconsideration. Okay. From CBAA, it goes to the CTA and bank. Why CTA and bank? Because LBAA took cognizance of the case in its original jurisdiction. CBAA, appellate na yan. Okay. Kaya pag umakyat, CTA and bank. Okay. Now, with respect to illegal assessment, please take note that if the question deals with whether or not the assessor has an authority under the law to perform such assessment, ano yan? the taxpayer need not comply with the administrative remedies provided under the local government code. And therefore, immediate resort to judicial action shall be allowed. That's the case of T versus Trump. Before I go to tax refunds, let me highlight LRTA kasi penned by Justice Hernando. In the case of LRTA, meron din question kung illegal assessment ba yun or erroneous assessment. Because in this particular case, umakyat ka agad si LRTA sa courts. So ang tanong, kailangan bang nag-pay under protest muna siya? Or kailangan bang nag-LBAA siya? Okay. In order for us to appreciate LRTA, we need to compare it with NPC case. Si NPC case, ang sabi ni NPC, oy teka, exempt ako sa real property tax. Pero ang sabi ng Supreme Court, erroneous assessment yan. If there's a question on whether or not a property is exempt, it's an erroneous assessment and therefore you should have paid under protest, and you should have filed an appeal before LBAA. Sa LRTA, sabi ng Supreme Court, ang issue dito ay whether or not the LRTA property shall be exempt, diba? Pero sabi ng Korte Suprema, the difference between NPC and LRTA is this. Sa petition ni LRTA, ang question niya ay authority of the assessor to make an assessment over LRTA properties, being that LRTA is an instrumentality. Sabi naman ng Korte Suprema sa NPC, yung allegations doon sa complaint ay more on a dispute as to the correctness of the amount assessed. So basically, the Supreme Court held that those are the differences between the two cases. And which is why the Supreme Court ruled that in the case of LRTA, it should be treated as an illegal assessment and not an erroneous assessment. So here's the catch. Pag sa bar may tinanong na exempt ba yung property or hindi, tignan mo muna kung meron dun sa facts na nagsasabing kung i-question yung authority ni ni assessor. Kasi kung ang main cause of action is an issue dealing with whether or not the assessor and the treasurer have the authority, then you can conclude based on LRTA case, and that is, it's an illegal assessment, therefore immediate resort to courts shall be allowed. Okay, let's go to refunds. For refund, please take note that the refund under the NIRC, meaning for internal revenue taxes, can be found under Section 229 or 112. Section 112 deals with refund of unutilized input VAT, which must be attributable to zero-rated or effectively zero-rated transaction. Hindi kailangang attributed siya, hindi kailangang directly attributed. Ang sabi sa batas, attributable. Hindi directly attributed. Okay. Now, in this case, you just need to remember sa problem, tingnan mo, okay, ano ang tax na nire-refund? Pag sinabi dun sa problem, refund of unutilized input VAT, ang next mo na question ay, is the taxpayer engaged in zero-rated or effectively zero-rated transaction? Kasi kung yes na naman yon, then obviously, ang mag-a-apply ay Section 112. Okay. Section 229, all overpayment, erroneous payment, or illegal payment. Now, why do we need to know whether the problem will fall under 229 and 112? Because the rules are different. One, the prescriptive period for the filing of an admin claim for refund is different under 229 and 112. For 229, it's 2 years. 112, 2 years. Sabihin niyo sa akin, pinaglululoko mo naman kami, mami. 2 years din naman yun eh. Yung reckoning date niya, magkaiba. Under 229, the 2-year period will be counted from the date of payment regardless of any supervening event. And date of payment means the date of filing of the final adjustment return or the annual income tax return in cases of income taxes or creditable withholding taxes. Pero pagdating sa final tax or final withholding tax, the 2-year period will be counted from the date of actual remittance. Because the date of payment for final withholding taxes shall mean the date of actual remittance. Metrobank case. Okay. Sa 112, the 2-year period will not be counted from the date of payment. Rather, it will be counted from the close of the taxable quarter when the sales were made. So if the sales were made in the month of January, then the 2-year period will be reckoned from March 31 of the same year. So if it's January 2022, then it's March 31, 2022. Yan yung reckoning date ng 2-year period. Okay. Please take note that this 2-year period under 229 will apply to judicial claims for refund as well. Because the 2-year period counted from the date of payment must be the prescriptive period for both admin claim for refund and judicial claim for refund. Under Section 112, the 2-year period will apply only to admin claims for refund. It will apply only to admin claims for refund. Because under Section 112, the judicial claim for refund will be filed. Pag sinabi kong judicial claim, I am referring to the petition for review filed before the CTA division, will be filed or must be filed within 30 days from the receipt of the decision. Can this 30-day period fall beyond the 2-year period? Yes. 229. Pag 229, the petition for review must be filed within 30 days from the receipt of the decision. But the 30-day period must not go beyond the 2-year period. Kasi nga yung 2-year period will apply to both admin claim and judicial claim. Okay. Also, the invoicing requirements such as imprinting the word zero rated on the receipt, such as indicating the word VAT and the tax identification number of the taxpayer on the receipt, are all applicable only when the refund falls under Section 112A. If the refund falls under Section 229, those invoicing requirements will not be material. Okay. So in this particular case of PNB versus CIR, a 2022 case, where the ITR was filed on April 15, 2011, but was amended December 26, 2012, please take note that the 2-year period will still be counted from the date of filing of the original return, because the filing of an amended return without additional taxes being paid is considered a supervening event. So obviously, if we will count it from April 15, 2011, the taxpayer will have until April 15, 2013 to file both admin and judicial claim for refund. When was the admin claim for refund filed? January 10. Paano naman yung, admin claim, January 10. Judicial claim, April 12. Were both filed within the 2-year prescriptive period? The answer is yes. Pero isang tinanong dito, teka, sabi, wala pang desisyon ang CIR, nag-file ka na ng judicial claim for refund. Anong sabi ng Korte Suprema? Taxpayer need not wait the BIR's action on the admin claim for refund before going to the CTA, especially that in this particular case, the period is already about to expire. Alam niyo, meron yung case din, 1 month na lang yung natitira dun sa 2-year period. Ang sabi ng Supreme Court, pwede na mag-judicial claim because the period is already about to expire. So earlier, I already explained that the period to file a claim for refund with respect to both admin and judicial had not yet prescribed. Now, please take note that before filing a judicial claim for refund, the admin claim for refund must be filed first. That's mandatory, except when the overpayment is clearly shown on the face of the return. Refunds will not prosper if the taxpayer had already opted to carry over the excess payments. So if the taxpayer already chose that a particular excess payment for a taxable period will be carried over to the succeeding periods, pag napili na yan, carry over, that is irrevocable. Meaning the only option of the taxpayer is to carry over the excess payments until it is fully exhausted. Paano kung pinili niya ay refund? Pwedeng magpalit? Pwede pang magpalit. Sabi ng Korte Suprema, sa University of Physicians case, yung option to refund is not irrevocable. The irrevocability rule will apply only when the choice is to carry over the excess payments. Let us compare the rules with respect to refunds of local tax. Yun ay for internal revenue tax. Paano pag local tax? Parehas, 2 years from the date of payment. Ano yung pagkakaiba? Walang regardless of any supervening event. Because for refunds of local taxes, supervening events are considered. In fact, 2-year period will be counted from the date when the taxpayer is entitled to a refund. Pwede siyang yun ang reckoning date. Okay. Should a written claim for refund be filed first? Yes, before the local treasurer, and this is also mandatory. Saan aakyat? Saan ang judicial claim for refund? Pag internal revenue tax, ang judicial claim for refund ay sa CTA division. Pag local tax, ang judicial claim for refund will either be MTC or RTC depending on the jurisdictional amount. 2 million or less, MTC will acquire original jurisdiction over the judicial claim for refund. Sana akyat, RTC. From RTC, sana akyat, CTA and bank. Why? RTC took cognizance of the case in its appellate jurisdiction. Paano kung more than 2 million? RTC will take original jurisdiction. Aggrieved, CTA division, MRMNT, and then CTA and bank. Please take note that if the taxpayer received an assessment, the taxpayer may file a protest and then appeal that protest, or the taxpayer may also pay the tax and then thereafter seek a refund. As long as, of course, kung pay siya, dapat payment under protest. No? So dapat meron pa ring protest filed before the local treasurer. That is the case of City of Manila versus Philippine Beverage Partners, a 2019 case. Let's compare it with RPT. Sa RPT, napakadali. Sabi ng local government code, yung procedure for protest, yun din daw ang procedure sa refund. So, saan magpa-file muna? Local treasurer. Saan aakyat? LBAA, tapos CBAA. Ganon, no? Pagka refund of local tax. Yun na, pagkakaiba, internal revenues, petition for review before CTA division, 'di ba? Pag internal revenue tax. Pag local tax, either MTC or RTC. Pag real property tax, LBAA. Okay. Special remedies which you might want to take note of. If there's a question as to the legality or constitutionality of a tax ordinance, the proper remedy is to file an appeal before the Secretary of Justice within 30 days from the effectivity of the tax ordinance. If this has not been complied with, then there is a failure to comply with the doctrine of exhaustion of administrative remedies. The SOJ will have a 60-day period to decide. Okay, 60 days to decide. Inaction shall be treated as an implied denial. So saan ang akyat? Ang akyat RTC. From SOJ, okay, pwedeng mag-file ng petition for declaratory relief before the regional trial court. Okay, within 30 days from the receipt of the decision or from the lapse of the 60-day period. Okay. Now, in the case of New Vision, a 2021 case, merong ordinansa na pinasa ang probinsya ng Cagayan. Okay. So, yung ordinansa na yon gustong questionin ni New Vision because the ordinance imposes franchise tax on holders of administrative franchises. Kasi si New Vision, may CATV siya na franchise. CATV is actually a franchise issued by the NTC. So, admin franchise siya. So, gusto niya questionin yon. So, kaya siya umakyat sa RTC. But then the case has been dismissed because there was a failure to comply with Section 187 of the Local Government Code. Sabi ng Korte Suprema, since New Vision attacked the legality of the tax ordinance, then it should have filed an appeal first before the Secretary of Justice within 30 days from the enactment or from the effectivity of the ordinance. So, in this case, there was actually a failure to comply with the doctrine of exhaustion of administrative remedies. Now, another reminder under remedies would be this. Baka kasi may tanong na, will CTA acquire jurisdiction? Pag ang tanong ay, will CTA acquire jurisdiction? Tingnan mo, local tax case ba yan? Pag local tax cases, local tax case ba yan? Pag local tax case yan, CTA will acquire jurisdiction. If it involves the legality of an assessment, tax case yan. Protest, tax case yan. Refund, tax case yan. Claims for tax exemption, tax case yan. Issue on prescription of assessments or collection, tax case yan. Okay. Sa case ni Bactel, it's quite different kasi ganito. May para lang tayo nagchismisan sa kanto, no? Ang case ni Bactel, ang nangyari, meron ng pending case sa court. Yung pending na case sa court, ang issue doon ay liable ba siya sa local business tax or hindi. So may pending case na. Ngayon, nag-file ulit ng isang case, in another case, ang issue na ngayon ay, dapat bang mag-issue ng Makati ng temporary business permit while this case is pending? Kasi nga ayaw mag-issue ni City of Makati kasi nga hindi nagbabayad ng local business tax. Ngayon ang tanong, will the second case be treated as a local tax case? Kasi dito, saan ba, ang tanong ay saan aakyat? CA or CTA? From RTC, CA or CTA? Okay. Ang sabi ng Supreme Court, ang akyat nito CA. Why? The issue is just on whether or not the local government unit should issue a temporary business permit. There is actually no question about whether or not the local business tax is to be imposed because that is the subject matter of the other case. Okay. And since it does not involve the reasonableness or a dispute on the reasonableness of the assessment or the legality of the assessment, then it cannot be considered a local tax case. So ang akyat dapat CA instead of RTC. Well, in cases of real property taxes naman, no, there are actions involving the validity of a tax sale. Please take note that if an action involves the validity of a tax sale, there is a deposit requirement. But the deposit requirement will be applicable only if the real property is tax delinquent. Okay. If there is a claim, if there is a claim for tax exemption, then the property is not tax delinquent. If the real property tax has been paid prior to the filing of the case, then the property is not tax delinquent, and therefore the deposit requirement is not applicable. Okay. If the validity of a tax sale, has been raised as a defense rather than as a cause of action in an initiatory case or action, then the deposit requirement will also not be applicable because the deposit requirement applies only to initiatory actions assailing the validity of tax sales. Well, in this case of Solco, no, it was just raised in the answer, not in the complaint. Okay. Another case is the case of Salva versus Magpile. Ano ulit yan? By jurisdiction ba ang CTA? Yan na naman ang question. Now, in this particular case, there has been a question as to whether or not there has been a denial of due process kasi daw yung notice was sent to a wrong address. And dahil nga yung notice was sent to a wrong address, edi hindi siya nakapag-participate during the bidding. Okay. In this case, walang dispute, no, as to the correctness of the real property tax. Ang claim lang niya ay merong denial of due process in levying the property. So according to the Supreme Court, the case should be filed before the CA, Court of Appeals, and not the CTA, Court of Tax Appeals. Why? Because this particular case does not involve the validity or legality or reasonableness or correctness of a real property tax assessment. And in order for it to be considered a tax issue, it must involve any of those subject matters. Now, since we're done with civil cases, let's talk about criminal case. For criminal case, please take, I'm including this because of the recent jurisprudence dealing with the same topic. The prescriptive period for criminal cases would be 5 years, counted from the discovery of the commission of the offense and the institution of judicial proceedings. Take note of the use of the conjunction, its end. So hindi magsisimulang magbilang yung 5 taon kung hindi nag-file ng affidavit complaint sa piskalya. So in the case of Lim versus CA, institution of judicial proceedings has been defined as the filing of an affidavit complaint in court. In court before the office of the prosecutor. Yun ha. So magsa-start magbilang pag meron ng affidavit complaint before the office of the prosecutor. Yung recent jurisprudence, I forgot the years I'll just make up the years, but same principle. Doon sa recent jurisprudence, ang nangyari, na-discover yung crime 2015. Nag-file ng affidavit complaint before the office of the prosecutor 2015. Okay? Na-file yung information sa court 2022. Okay. Tanong, prescribed na ba? Answer, yes. No? Kasi dapat, yung information was filed in court within the 5-year period counted from the discovery and the filing of an affidavit complaint before the office of the prosecutor. The CTA can acquire exclusive original jurisdiction over collection cases provided that the principal amount of tax is equivalent to 1 million or more and it involves final and executory assessments. So if the assessment is 1 million but the assessment is not yet final and executory, MTC shall acquire jurisdiction because the jurisdictional amount falls within MTC's jurisdiction. Okay. If the assessment is 1 million, but the assessment is already final and executory, then that's the only time that CTA will acquire jurisdiction. In criminal cases, the CTA will acquire exclusive original jurisdiction over criminal cases where the principal amount of tax is at least 1 million pesos. Can there be suspension of collection of taxes in cases of filing of cases before the CTA or before any courts? Answer, if the problem involves an internal revenue tax, then there shall be no writ to be issued to restrain the collection. Bawal yan, Section 218. But if the problem involves a real property tax or a local tax, there can be writs of injunction issued against the collection thereof. Why? There is no similar provision under the local government code. Please take note, however, that under RA 9282, CTA can suspend the collection of the tax if CTA, after hearing, determines that the collection will be prejudicial to the interest of the government and or the taxpayer. The CTA may require deposits, okay, or posting of bonds, but this may be dispensed with if it can be seen that the means employed by the government in order to collect the tax is not sanctioned by law, if there has been denial of due process, or if there is an argument as to prescription. So in these three instances, the deposit requirement may be dispensed with. Another recent jurisprudence involves dispute between government agencies. Meron dati SAM, SAM and then si BIR ang nag-aaway. Ang sabi, ang merong jurisdiction dyan, hindi CTA, pero SOJ, Secretary of Justice. Okay. Meron naman away, Department of Energy, tapos si BIR. Yan, 2022 case. Department of Energy, tapos si BIR. Sino daw dapat ang mag-acquire ng jurisdiction? SOJ, hindi CTA. Why? Because it involves dispute between agencies in the executive department. Parehas kasi silang agency ng executive department, kaya dapat ang punta SOJ. Yung COMELEC, nagkaroon ng dispute between COMELEC and BIR. Okay, saan ang akyat? Dahil daw ang COMELEC ay hindi agency under the executive department, ang akyat CTA. Okay, so those are the recent jurisprudence. Now, question, can the CTA and bank have jurisdiction over resolutions or orders of the CTA division, including the issuance of a writ of certiorari? The answer is yes. The CTA and bank has exclusive appellate jurisdiction over decisions, resolutions, or orders of a division of the CTA. And this, of course, includes the authority to resolve petition for certiorari assailing the decision, resolution, or order of the CTA division. Now, pertinent principles that I'd like to remind you under local tax would be rule of preemption. Ano ang rule of preemption? Rule of preemption states that if the subject matter is already subject to tax by the national government, then it should not be subject of a local tax imposition unless the local government code provides, okay? Unless the local government code provides for such imposition. Example, percentage tax, okay? Percentage tax cannot be imposed by the local government units because percentage tax is already being imposed and collected by the national government. However, the local government code allows local government units to impose amusement taxes. Okay. Since the local government code allows it, then amusement taxes can be collected by local government units. But it should fall within the concept of amusement tax. Take note, amusement tax may be imposed only upon amusement places. And amusement places has been defined, the term amusement places has been defined as a place where one seeks admission and pays a fee, of course, and there is an artistic display of expression. So going inside a resort, although one will be visually entertained, will not be considered as an amusement place, no? Pili's Lloyd case. Please take note that the local government code indicates specific types of taxes which may be imposed by the barangay, by the city, by the province. Example, provinces can impose transfer taxes, but municipalities cannot. What else? Local business taxes may be imposed by municipalities, but provinces cannot. Okay. In this particular case, no, it's a recent jurisprudence. And in this case, there was a question on whether the imposition of a franchise tax by the municipality of Muntinlupa is valid. At the time that the revenue code was enacted, no, the local government unit was still classified as a municipality. And in the revenue code, it imposed franchise taxes. Under the local government code, franchise taxes must be imposed by provinces or cities. And in this particular case, no, Muntinlupa was classified as a municipality. And so the Supreme Court held that the revenue code is declared ultra vires, okay, because the municipality has no authority to impose franchise taxes. Okay. What are the principles that I'd like to highlight under real property taxes? Under real property taxes, I need to highlight the definition of real property, subject to real property tax. The concept of real property is not confined under Section 415 of the Civil Code, no? Because real properties may include machineries and improvements, as long as the machineries are actually directly and exclusively used to meet the needs of a particular industry, and by their very nature and purpose, the machineries are designed for or necessary for manufacturing, mining, logging, industrial, commercial, agricultural. Okay. Pag yon na-comply with real property subject to real property tax. Epic case would be the case of Filipinas Palm. Ang nangyari kasi dito, si Filipinas Palm, no, and may plantation siya, tas engaged siya dun sa pag-manufacture ng coconut products. Okay. Anong nangyari? Meron siyang truck, mini truck. Yung mini truck, ginagamit niya pang harvest ng fruits. Okay. Sinobject yun sa real property tax. Gustong sabihin, kung i-animate ko yung argument, sabi ni Filipinas, joke ka? Gumagalaw to. Vehicle, mobile, di ba? Bakit mo sa subjectan ng real property tax to? Okay. But the Supreme Court held that it is considered real property, subject to real property tax. Why? First, the mini truck is actually directly and exclusively used in order to meet the needs of Filipinas palm oil in its manufacturing industry. And it is used for manufacturing, di ba? So the two elements were complied with. Hence, the truck, even though it's movable, is classified as a real property subject to real property tax. Actually, the questions related to real property taxes will deal with real property tax exemption enumerated under Section 234 of the Local Government Code. The first item pertains to real property owned by the Republic of the Philippines or any of its political subdivisions, except when the beneficial use has been granted for consideration or otherwise to a taxable entity. So, hindi kailangan nagbabayad yung taxable entity, no? Ang importante, sino ang gumagamit. Okay. If the real property is owned by the Republic of the Philippines but being used by an instrumentality, is it subject to tax? No. Kasi nga, ang instrumentality ay considered a non-taxable entity pursuant to Section 1330 of the Local Government Code. Okay. What about those portions being used by taxable entities? Sabi mo, concessionaires. Well, only those portions shall be subject to tax. Okay. Now, Section 234B pertains to the constitutional tax exemption. Di ba? Yan yung Section 28.3, Article 6 of the 1987 Constitution. Ngayon, balikan ulit natin ang Long Center of the Philippines. Long Center of the Philippines is a non-stock, non-profit hospital which accepts paying and non-paying patients. Okay. Yung building niya, no, first floor, ginagamit, pinapaupa sa mga doctors, pinapaupa sa doctors. Yung remaining floors, rooms na yan, being used by both paying and non-paying patients. Ang tanong, will this property be subject to tax? Sabi ng Supreme Court, yung first floor lang, yung subject to tax. Why? Because the first floor has been leased to doctors and therefore they are not used for religious, educational, or charitable purpose. But the remaining floors will be considered as exempt from tax because the acceptance of paying patients by Long Center of the Philippines will not derogate its character as a charitable institution. Meaning, it still conducts charitable activities, no? So that's the case of Long Center of the Philippines. I will not highlight letter C, but please remember that this tax exemption pertains only to machineries and equipment. It will not involve structures. Okay? Also, letter E. It involves machineries and equipment, but will not extend to structures. Okay? I will explain letter D. Letter D is an ownership exemption. Why is it considered ownership exemption? It is considered an ownership exemption because, okay, the usage of the property will not be material, only the ownership thereof. As long as the real property is owned by a duly registered cooperative under the Cooperative Development Authority, then the real property will be exempt. Balik tayo kay Filipinas. Alam nyo, yung kwentong yan na nangyari. May co-op, may kwento pa before doon, no? Pero paiksihin na lang natin. Yung co-op, siya yung nagmamay-ari ng lupa. Pinaupa yon kay Filipinas Palm. Sabi nung assessor, dapat magbayad si Filipinas ng real property tax kasi siya yung beneficial user. Okay. Being the beneficial user, siya yung liable for the tax. And hindi na exempt kasi hindi naman yung co-op ang gumagamit but rather taxable entity. Okay. Ano sabi ng Supreme Court? Sabi ng Supreme Court, the real property is still exempt from tax. Why? Because it is owned by a cooperative registered under the CDA. Kahit pag ang gumagamit niyan ay taxable entity, it will not matter, no? Because this is not a usage exemption but rather an ownership exemption. What is material is the ownership over the property. So as long as the real property is owned by a cooperative registered under the CDA, then it will be exempt from tax. Okay. There are several cases enumerated in this particular slide which you might want to revisit. No? Please take note of the case of UP versus Quezon City. Ano yung case na to? O, kukwento ulit natin na parang nagchichismisan lang tayo sa kanto para matandaan nyo. Yung case na to ganito. Si UP, pinaupa niya yung property niya kay Ayala. Yan yung Ayala Techno Hub sa Quezon City. So, pinaupa niya. Yung proceeds, okay, meaning yung rental income. Yung rental income na kinita, okay, yung rental income na kinita ni UP, okay, ay ginamit for educational purposes. Okay. Tanong, will the real property be subject to tax? The answer to this would be that iisipin nyo, no? Naku, ano yan? Subject sa tax. Okay? Iisipin nyo, naku, subject sa tax kasi nga being used by a taxable entity, Ayala. But this is a different case because the charter of UP, okay? The charter of UP provides for what? An exemption. Okay, sabi doon, if the property, okay, is used for other purposes, but the amount derived, meaning the proceeds, no, or income derived from the use of the property will be used for educational purposes, then the real property is also exempt from tax. So in this particular case, since the rental income was used for educational purposes, then obviously it will be, the property will be exempt. Okay, now, let us talk about the doctrine of ownership and the doctrine of usage. Please take note that as a general rule, no, the registered owner is the one liable for real property tax. However, if the registered owner is exempt, then we apply the beneficial use principle. And that is, the obligation to pay the real property tax shall now rest on the person who derives benefit from its utilization. Now, this has been applied in the case of Unimasters versus Tacloban City. Because in this particular case, no, the hotel is commonly owned by the province of Leyte, a political subdivision, and two instrumentalities of the government. All of them, meaning all of the registered owners, are exempt from tax. But these owners had entered into a lease contract with a private entity. And the Supreme Court held that the beneficial user, UCI, shall be liable for the real property taxes. Okay. For purposes of exemption, please take note of the concept of usage. Exemption under Section 28.3, Article 6 of the Constitution. Usage lahat yan. REC purposes, religious, educational, or charitable. Ngayon, punta tayo sa appraisal. A real property shall be classified, valued, and assessed based on its actual use. Okay? A real property shall be classified, valued, and assessed based on its actual use. And this has been explained in the case of City Assessor of Cebu versus Asociación of Benevola de Cebu. In this 2007 case, now, which has already been asked in the bar exams, the hospital, okay, built a medical arts center. Okay? The medical arts center housed doctors. So, pinaupa nila sa mga doktor. But these doctors are affiliates of the hospital. So, ang nandun lang sa MAC or Medical Arts Center ay mga doktor na affiliated with the hospital. Ang main issue dito was whether or not the Medical Arts Center shall be classified as a commercial, okay? A commercial or a special property. Okay? Kasi pag commercial property siya, ang assessment level niya 35%. Pag special property siya, ang assessment level niya ay 10%. Bakit importante ang assessment level? Because if the assessment level is lower or the assessment rate is lower, then the real property tax is also lower, diba? And that's why they had a dispute as to the assessment level of this property. According to the Supreme Court, no, the medical arts center shall not be treated as a commercial property, but rather as a special property because the medical arts center is incidental to and reasonably necessary for the operations of the hospital. And the hospital is classified as one which has a special property based on the ordinance of Cebu. So in this particular case, you can see that for purposes of classification, you consider incidental use. But for purposes of exemption, particularly under Section 28(3), Article 6 of the 1987 Constitution, you do not consider incidental use as part of the tax exemption. Pero pag classification of the property to determine the assessment level, you consider incidental use. Okay. So those are the important matters that I'd like to discuss in this session. But before I will open the session for question and answer, I'd like to mention one case decided in 2023. It's the case involving ACES Philippines and ACES Indonesia and PLDT. ACES Philippines entered into an agreement with PLDT. Ang gagawin, magbibigay siya ng satellite communication time kay PLDT. Okay. ACES Indonesia, on the other hand, transacted with ACES Philippines kasi parang tatlong entity eh. ACES Indonesia, siya yung magde-deliver ng communication time kay ACES Philippines. Si ACES Philippines naman ang magde-deliver kay PLDT. Ngayon, ang tanong dito ay, will the income be subject to tax? Kasi may argument na the income is not sourced within. Okay. Ang kumita basically ay a non-resident foreign corporation, si ACES Indonesia. Will the income accrued be considered as income sourced within? Because if it is, then it will be subject to tax. Okay. Ang sabi ng Korte Suprema, the accrual of the income transpired when the routed call has been received at the gateway. And the gateway is in the Philippines kasi dito natanggap yung call. And since the accrual of the income pertains to the receipt of the routed call, then the income is sourced within. So yan yung, take note ang argument lang dito would be whether or not the income is sourced within. And ano ang focus mo lang? Source of income is the activity that had produced the income. In this particular case, the activity that had produced the income is not the transmission kasi may argument na yung satellite ay nasa outer space eh. Is not the transmission but rather the act of receiving the routed call. So that is the case of ACES Philippines. Now, that is the end of my lecture. I wish everyone blessings from the Lord Almighty. I know that you will all be blessed, and I know that you are prepared. And so, as a final note, please remember that at this point, you should never ever doubt yourself. No, believe that you can make it, and the Lord will make it happen. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
All right, so that concludes such a comprehensive lecture on taxation law. Thank you once again, Dean Elveña. So again, we want to extend our heartfelt appreciation for our lecture today because wow, almost 3 hours of refreshing and reviewing us of the most important legal concepts and jurisprudence in taxation law. Now, we would like to open the floor to our audience, to our law students and barristers, especially in the Facebook Live for our Q&A portion. So you can use our FB Live comment section to input your question so we can ask it directly to Dean Elveña. All right. So, Dean, for our first question, it's regarding the non-stock, non-profit educational institutions. I believe it's one of the topics na medyo confusing because first there's ADE and then the second one is Section 30H. So, this question is more of like a clarification na does it mean po ba na even though di siya pasok under the ADE qualification, will it still not be taxable yung ating NSNP educational institution because of Section 30H?
Well, please take note that in order for a non-stock non-profit educational institution to be exempt under Section 38, it is necessary that there has to be compliance with the operational test. So, saan kinita yung income? If the income has been sourced from educational activities because that is the purpose for which the entity has been established, then it will be exempt. So, example nga, no? Income from tuition fees. So, saan na-derive yung tuition fees? It's from the educational activities of that non-stock, non-profit educational institution. And therefore, regardless of the disposition of the income from tuition fees, it will be exempt, not pursuant to the constitutional provision, but rather pursuant to Section 30 of the NIRC. Section 43, Article 14 of the 1987 Constitution will come into the picture when it comes to your analysis if the problem involves an income from an activity conducted for profit. Because if the income has already been sourced from an activity conducted for profit, it is not exempt under Section 30 of the NIRC because the second paragraph states that regardless of the disposition made thereof, any income derived from activities conducted for profit or any property, whether real or personal, shall be subject to tax. So makikita natin na hindi importante ang usage of the income sa Section 30. But what is material is the source of the income. So pag may problem na ang income na has been sourced from an activity conducted for profit, wag mo nang gamitin ang Section 30. Ano na ngayon ang titingnan mo? Section 43, Article 14 of the 1987 Constitution. And what is crucial here in the grant of tax exemption would be the manner on how the income has been used. If the income has been actually directly and exclusively used for educational purpose, then it will be exempt from tax. Just a hint. In the previous bar examination questions, hindi sinasabi kung paano nagamit yung income. And so I think it is very crucial for you to make a qualification if in case that you will conclude that the income is exempt, no? So lagyan mo, provided that the income has been actually directly and exclusively used for educational purposes. I hope that addressed the question.
All right. Dean, we have another question from Clarice Zaplan. Ang question niya po is, are there available tax incentives and safeguards for potential foreign investors planning to invest here in the Philippines?
Well, if there are potential incentives available to investors, no, in the Philippines, I believe the aspect there that we need to consider would be the type of the income, because there are different types of income, and if the investor is an individual taxpayer, the income will depend, the tax treatment will depend on the income earned by the foreign investor. So example, if the foreign investor would want to invest in facilities such as money market placements, if allowed, but I know right now it's not allowed, no, for foreign investors, and they earn interest income from a bank account, and if that bank account is a foreign currency denominated unit, the interest income is exempt. So that alone is considered as a tax avoidance scheme, no? Na instead na mag-invest sa peso, mag-invest sa foreign currency. Okay, if the foreigner is not residing in the Philippines. Another aspect, if a foreigner will invest in shares of stocks, okay, if a foreigner will invest in shares of stocks, it is very crucial to determine whether there are treaties between the domiciliary country of that foreigner and the Philippine government, because there are certain treaties where the dividend income will be exempt, no? And so that has to be looked into as well. And then another set of rules will be determined if the investor is not just an individual, but rather a foreign corporation. That's another angle. But really, I don't think that it will be asked in the bar exams. But I just like to satisfy the curiosity of Clarice. Did I get her name right? Yeah, Clarice.
All right. Next one would be is the medical arts center tax exempt as incidental use by Marion Seg.
Hi, Marian. Okay. So it's not exempt. In that particular case of Benevola de Cebu, the main question is really not on tax exemption, but rather the classification of the property in determining the assessment level of the property. No, please take note that for tax exemption purposes, it will be exempt if the property has been actually directly and exclusively used for religious, educational, or charitable purpose. In this case, Benevola de Cebu does not enjoy tax exemption because it is not using its properties for any of those purposes enumerated under Section 28(3), Article 6 of the 1987 Constitution. However, the main issue here is, yes, it is taxable, but what is the proper assessment level? And this is the reason why I need to emphasize that for purposes of classification, we consider the incidental use of the property. But for purposes of tax exemption, we no longer consider the incidental usage of the property. That has been changed under the 1987 Constitution, because the difference between the 1973 and the 1987 Constitution is the inclusion of the adverb exclusively. Prior to the 1987 Constitution, the word exclusively was not included, but it was included under the 1987 Constitution. Kaya ang ibig daw sabihin nun ay solely. Okay. And so, will we apply the jurisprudential tenet in the case of Abra Valley case? Sa Abra Valley kasi, may building, yung fifth floor ng building, ginagamit siya na residence ng presidente. First, second, third, fourth floors, ginagamit for classroom. So, obviously, first, second, third, fourth, educational purpose. Sa Abra Valley, sabi yung fifth floor daw exempt. Bakit? Because that is incidental to the educational purposes of the institution. But take note, that case was promulgated prior to the 1987 Constitution. So, pag promulgate yan under the 1987 Constitution, the fifth floor will no longer be exempt. Why? Because the incidental usage will no longer be covered by the tax exemption. And that is the importance of the inclusion of the word exclusively under the 1987 Constitution. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, very clearly, Dean. From Genesis Lee, the question is, Dean, if both the PAN and FAN were received at the same time, is the PAN still valid or both notices are void? Thank you.
Okay. If the PAN and the FAN were received at the same time, it does not mean that the PAN is void, no? The PAN is valid because it has been received. Only that the FAN is void because the FAN was issued within the 15-day period given to the taxpayer to file a reply. So this is the reason why it's crucial. Now, if the FAN is void, the validity of the PAN will be useless. Because what is needed in cases of administrative collection of taxes would be the validity of the formal assessment notice. Sabi nga sa CIR versus Reyes, a void assessment bears no fruit.
And for our last question, Dean, it's actually related with ADE. Is passive income from interest on deposits of the educational institution subject to tax, even if it's for ADE?
Okay. The interest income earned by an educational institution, take note, I'm referring to a non-stock, non-profit educational institution, may be exempt from tax provided that it can be proven that the interest income shall be actually directly and exclusively used for educational purposes. It can be proven through a project proposal for which the interest income shall be used. There should be a certification coming from the board on how the interest income shall be used as well. Meaning all the pieces of documents or pieces of evidence which will be needed in order to prove that the interest income shall be actually directly and exclusively used for educational purposes will be needed in order to justify the tax exemption of the interest income. Please take note that in answering this, I am also emphasizing the principle that the exemption, the omnibus tax exemption, as we describe it, no, under Section 4.3, Article 14 of the Constitution, is not automatic. It is not automatic because it has to be established that the revenue was indeed actually directly and exclusively used for educational purposes. Oh, by the way, the requirements in order that the interest income will be exempt from tax are enumerated under the revenue regulations.
All right. Thank you so much for clarifying those concepts or addressing those concerns, Dean. Siguro for our very last question is, meron po ba kayong mga last minute inspirational message and tips for our barristers considering na next week na po magsisimula lang ang kanilang bar exam?
Okay. Siguro last minute tip, do not forget the form of how you present the answer, no? You state first the categorical answer. You state a legal basis. If there's only one issue, one legal basis lang. Kasi the moment that you state like all the other principles, magmumukhang research paper ang sagot mo, di ba? So isa lang na legal basis. And then in your explanation, you must always be able to connect the facts of the problem and your legal basis. That is very crucial because the form of your answer also determines your competence, aside, of course, from the knowledge that you will indicate in your answer. But I think most importantly, of all the things that you need to remember that you are not alone in this. You need to remember that there's like a huge school cheering behind you. There's a huge community. Your relatives, your parents are all behind you, cheering on you from the background. And so do not worry too much. Just believe in yourself and that you should always remember that you had a long way to go in law school and that's just not nothing. That's like a huge achievement in itself. And this is already the final stretch. So why doubt yourself now? So never ever doubt yourself. I think that's all. And God bless everyone.
Okay, thank you once again, Dean Elveña. Nice words to top off this lecture session. Why doubt yourself? So for all our barristers watching right now, believe that you will pass and conquer the bar examinations in the next few days. So before everything else, now I would like to remind everyone of our remaining session. So tomorrow, we will have criminal law and we'll have Dean Christine as our lecturer. This is a last-minute reminder also to our viewers that kindly refrain from recording or reproducing our discussions and lectures today for any personal gain. Again, everyone can view anytime our lectures through the Pulse and Rex Education Facebook pages. And actually, that's it. Once again, thank you everyone for attending today's discussion. Thank you also to Pulse and Rex Education for being on top of this initiative for our 2023 barristers. And again, see you tomorrow for our next 3-week lecture. Bye everyone and have a blessed day.